Where there is no vision, the people perish. But he that keepeth the law, happy is he.
I looked into the casket, but my eyes were dazzled with the sight. They shone with 10 times their former glory.
I turned to look for the Advent people in the world, but could not find them, when a voice said to me, "Look again, and look a little higher." Nothing to fear for the future, except as we shall forget the way the Lord has led us, and his teaching in our past history.
Good afternoon, and thanks again for coming out. I know for a lot of people this was not easy to come out, but thank the Lord nonetheless, we're here. Last time we had this event, we were in Manhattan, and that was even more out of the way for a lot of people, but hopefully as time goes on, we will obviously have a better location, better place, something a little bit more permanent. So as you see, we would have termed it a journey to the future through the past, a review of Adventist history. And for those of you who weren't here last time, you may be wondering why the name of the title, A Journey to the Future Through the Past, is that we are looking at our history to realize what God has for us in the very near future, right? So that we see that the purpose for Adventism really was to answer the questions on the character of God. We had dealt with what was called the theodicy. It was a term that was developed by a guy called Gottfried Leibniz in Germany back in the 1700s, where all these issues started to arise over God being just, right? And so we know theodicy is theo, from the Greek meaning God, and the dike, meaning justice, right? So the issues on God being just and loving while amidst an evil world, these are all questions that come up. And the unfortunate thing is, as we said last time, is that as Adventists, we have a very good way of missing opportunities. We like to speak to people in a way of condemning, their particular lifestyle instead of revealing the character of God. And this is the prime opportunity for that to happen. I think it can still be redeemed, right? And so this is why we're looking through Adventist history. And so we're just going to do a basic recap of what we went through last time. So we began this study last time in Adventist history by looking at Proverbs 29:18. And I'm pretty sure we know what that says, that where there's no vision, the people perish. The Complete Jewish Bible says that where there's no prophetic vision, the people lose restraint, right? Which means that obviously what would have held their minds in check to the will of God, without that vision is not there. So we began to study in Proverbs 29:18, which establishes the fact that without a vision, without some bright future for the people of God to look forward to, they throw off restraint and have no legitimate purpose for existing as an entity within the world. So have we really reassessed why we exist as a people, right? We come and do this thing. We hear the term play church, right? We just come and, it's like come every Sabbath, sit in the pews, sing, read the Bible, and then we go back home, right? It's, I hope that we don't become comfortable with things being as the norm, right? Because, that is not how God would have it. If we would just think it's just, come to church, hear a sermon, sing a couple of songs, and then go on, it is a reestablishment of ceremonialism again, right? And it says on this premise that we saw that it was imperative to look at Adventist history and what was God's original plan for his movement, so that we would have greater motivation to do the work before us. Now, in our first session, we also used a statement from Life Sketches of Ellen White, page 196, as a guide, which states that what we are to fear is if we forget how God led us in the past, right? And beyond that, it is just as fearful if we forget why we exist as a movement, right? And then we're going to look at that statement a little bit closer now. So she says, in reviewing our past history, having traveled over every step of advance to our present standing, I can say, praise God. As I see what the Lord has wrought, I am filled with astonishment and with confidence in Christ as leader. We have nothing to fear for the future except as we shall forget the way the Lord has led us and his teaching in our past history. We are debtors to God to use every advantage he has entrusted to us to beautify the truth by wholeness of character. You realize that? So she says, beautify the truth by wholeness of character. So it means that the truth that we are presenting has power added to it by the lives that are in harmony with it, right? And to send the message of warning and of comfort, of hope and love to those who are in the darkness of error and sin. Life Sketches 196, paragraphs 2 and 3.
Which means, Brother Stephen, if we are to beautify the truth by the holiness of character, we can take that truth and darken it if we don't live in the holiness of character.
Correct. And I forgot to put the quotation in this slide, but I quoted a guy called Robert Hall. Now, Robert Hall was an 18th century theologian, and he wrote a book called Modern Infidelity Considered, meaning infidelity not in the sense of, what we would call marital infidelity, but he says the unbelief in the world, he says that infidelity is the offspring of corrupt Christianity, right? So when we are not living up to the truth, it breeds, unbelief. And unbelief that is, unfortunately, that is warranted. You understand what I'm saying? So there are people who do not believe in God, right, because of the testimony or the lack of testimony that we bear. So, just same point, it is important to note that the last statement we looked at focused primarily on the reproduction of God's character in our souls that strengthens the message that we preach. Now, a question we are asking, how does Adventism serve the purpose of vindicating God's character, right? And we've been going through that these past couple of Sabbaths. It says God's character is vindicated in the sanctuary, and the sanctuary became the foremost message of the Millerite and early Adventist movement, right? So how did the Adventist message become and stay relevant in the time that it emerged in the early 1800s? Let us remember, and before we get into that, let's remember the two periods in time that the world had to survive or go through, right? We have what is known as the Dark Ages, and I put in parentheses, the great darkening of God's character, right? Because you can imagine for 1,260 years that people are seeing God through the lens of what they see from the papacy, right? There are some people who do not understand Christianity outside of the reality of the papacy, right? So that what I'm saying by this is that the average person you meet judges Christianity by what he sees from the papacy, right? He doesn't understand what Ellen White calls primitive godliness from the days of the apostles, right? And it's so interesting. One point that I was making on Peter, you know how the papacy likes to say that Peter is the first pope? The irony of that, right, and the one question that the papacy has to answer is this: if Peter is the first pope, explain to me why Rome crucifies him in Rome, right? That's a question that they have to answer. And so why would you crucify your own pope? If he apostatized, well, you simply, let him go aside. But I've never seen any case where they would have treated their pope to the point of, so if anything, of all the popes that they've had from that time, if Peter is pope, he was the only one to be executed. Right. Right? So in this time we see the great darkening of God's character in the Dark Ages from 538 to 1798, right? And so, the Inquisition was a perfect example of that. The Inquisition was the papacy's tool to go and torture and, to kill Christians who did not, fall into line with what the papacy wanted, right? And it's so interesting that, Jesus said in John 16:2, he said there will come a time when men will think to take your life And Jesus said they would do that because they do not know me nor the Father, right? And so the papacy revealed that through the Inquisition, through the Jesuit order, and how they would deal with Christians. And obviously the world seeing this thinks this is what God is like, right? So now one thing that you have to learn about history is that you have a particular period, and then there's a period that responds to the period that went before. Very, very important to learn in history. So you will have the Dark Ages, and so there comes a period right after this that responds to this particular time, and this is a period known, right? The First Great Awakening. Well, really and truly, as a matter of fact, before we got there, and something should have come between here, what should have come between here was actually the Enlightenment era. The Enlightenment era says that if God is like that, we don't want anything to do with that. Let's get as far away from it as possible, right? Now, was everyone in the Enlightenment of what we would call an atheistic mind? No, there were skeptics to an extent. You have people like Immanuel Kant, right, who would have come with his perspectives on, morality. He wrote a book called The Metaphysics of Morality, all these kind of things. So you have that response through the Enlightenment era, right, which says, let us see if we can establish a way of operating, getting away from the biblical perspective, biblical worldview. Essentially what they were saying was getting away from the Catholic worldview. They didn't know that, but that was what they were running away from. And so the Enlightenment says, let's see what we can do to establish knowledge. And you remember, the Enlightenment was basically a period that said, let us focus on reason and allow reason to be our guide. Right. Is there anything for the child of God that is wrong with reason? No, there's nothing wrong with reason. But the problem is that the Enlightenment period is saying we're going to allow reason alone to be our guide. All right? And if you remember in the French Revolution, you had a particular person, I can't remember his name right now, but that was the idea that was injected through the French Revolution. And so obviously we saw the destruction that occurred from that period. And wherever that was instituted, destruction and chaos was what would follow, right? And so to response of the Enlightenment era, you have what's called the First Great Awakening, right? And they call it the First Great Awakening because now history says that there were at least 4 great periods of awakening, religious awakening, and particularly, even though they're speaking in general about the world, but it becomes more centered to America, right? So this First Great Awakening was a period of religious awakening in the 1730s that lasted up until the 1750s. That was a reaction to the Enlightenment era's separation from a religious paradigm. Right. Now, and remember, this is just still a recap. Now, it says the recap. What we're looking at are the problems that the First Great Awakening perpetuated. Right. Now, the preachers of this period targeted mostly believers that were already churchgoers and emphasized more of a get-it-done attitude, which perpetuates legalism. Right. So this was those guys of that period. You'll see some names like Jonathan Edwards and Samuel Davies and those guys, George Whitefield. Those particular preachers preached in a way of, he's there, and their mode was to go to an already established church. It was not like what we do today and go to regions where there are no believers. It was like, well, we come to those who are already believers, preach the truth to them, and to let them know to get things in order, right? And that was the type of preaching that categorized that particular period. Those 3 men were most prominent in that time, but to tell you the truth, almost every other preacher preached like that, really and truly, in that period. So you could imagine that even though you're coming away from the Dark Ages, you're coming away from the Enlightenment era, you still have people that see God a particular way and are presenting that reality, right? And so he said that the preaching of Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, and Samuel Davies was the general representation for the First Great Awakening preachers everywhere, and the hallmark of those messages were shaped by a avoid hell motivation, right? So we're told that the child of God is not to worship God because they're seeking to do what? Avoid hell or get into heaven. That is not the motivation for the child of God, right? And Jonathan Edwards, his most famous sermon was one called Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God. I don't know if I need to even go into the specifics of that sermon, right? But this is the perspective, right, that shaped that particular period. And as we said, it further contributed to the growing influence of atheism in this period, and not just atheism, but what we would know as secularism, humanism, those kind of isms that perpetuated that were perpetuated in that period. So atheism in this period, where the likes of people like Francois Voltaire and Thomas Paine had their strongest influence over other Enlightenment thinkers. Again, to recap, is the Second Great Awakening and the relevancy of Adventism. I'm sorry that I'm speeding along so quickly. So, unlike the messengers of the First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening preachers took on more of an evangelistic approach that went beyond the borders of their home churches. They saw the message as embracing all the peoples of the world. In this time, particularly around the 1840s, there was a non-traditional and non-deferential attitude towards religion on the whole, and various theories on the character of God and the creation of our world that tended towards humanism, atheism, and similar paradigms, right? Now, the Second Great Awakening and the relevancy of Adventism again, as Bliss's memoir of William Miller expressed, there was a surprisingly dismissive attitude toward the idea of the second advent of Christ in most of the Christian denominations, and for that reason, Miller was not always well received in the lectures that he gave. And I gave the pages to support that, pages 89 and 185. Let me just read one of the things that he says there, right, that was said about Miller's experience. On page 89 of Memoirs of William Miller, it says, he says, I had previously only thrown out occasional hints of my views. I then began to speak more clearly my opinions to my neighbors, to ministers and others. To my astonishment, I found very few who listened with any interest. Christians who were listening to his preaching on the second coming of Christ and did not listen to it with any particular interest. So how did the world get to that point where Christians were no longer focused on the second advent of Christ, right? It had become ceremony, right? How many of us, listen, as much as it is important for us to experience this truth, how many of us actually have the advent on our mind, right? The coming of Christ and the finishing of this work. Because the Bible does say, according to Paul, that he will finish the work and will cut it short in righteousness. We have to keep the second coming of Christ in mind. The reason why we are living the life that we do in Christ, yes, is for the purpose of glorifying him, but it's also a part of what we spoke about in doing justice, in bringing this to an end and allowing the Lord to come back to grab his people, right? And again, on page 185, this idea is supported, 185, Bliss. Yes. Now listen to how one man described William Miller. He says, I wrote you yesterday, among other news, that Mr. Miller, the end of the world man, was here. This is how Miller was often derogatively spoken of. The end of the man world, right? You know, the end of the world man. That was how some people spoke of him. And so God used Miller in this time. In a sense, he became the appointed man to reorient humanity to the reality of Christ's second coming. So I want us to learn something, that even though Miller was not right in every respect, right, in terms especially to that particular time in 1844 when we get to that, I want us to realize that God uses people at certain times for certain reasons, right? And this is why we see the present truth that is applicable for every particular period. And Miller had to bring people's minds back to the reality of Christ's second coming, right? Because the world was, could you imagine the dark ages? This is what is covering the world so intensively, and the mind is not even there. And you have people like even Martin Luther, who in the 1500s when he was writing, actually said that the coming of Christ was not going to be for like another 300 years. Martin Luther could say that he realized the time that he was in, he understood the time he was in, and could say the coming of Christ is not going to be for at least another 300 years. And Martin Luther wasn't exactly wrong, you know. You know why? Because if the people of God had understood the work that they had to do, right, and move forward, that in that 1800 period, the work could have been finished. It could have been finished. All right, and so that's the end of the recap. So we're going to see how much we can get covered today, and then hopefully next week we can cover it a little bit more. So just want to give a little background on William Miller, all right? It says William Miller was born in Pittsfield, Massachusetts on February 15, 1782 to Captain William Miller. So his father was an army man, right? And Paulina Miller, who was formerly Paulina Phelps, right? Grew up with a Baptist heritage, which he later gave up and embraced deism. Now we know what deism is. Deism was a perspective that said that, and there are more facets to it than this, but deism said God created the world, but just left it basically to fend for itself, right? God, there was no personal God that came in and dealt with the world. And as we will see, some educators say that deism actually tends toward atheism. Because if you don't think that there's a personal God, right, then where does belief for God come in? If there's no personal relationship, I don't need to know God. And basically, you're living a life that is free from the influence of God. Right? He later became a military man like his father, and this is very important because Miller, we will see that Miller embraced deism about 1804, right? 1804 was when Miller became a deist, and by about 1816 is when he picked up his belief in God again, just because of that period of the Second Great Awakening. But Miller explains, especially in his memoirs, and I don't know how far, some people have to, but I don't know how far Brother Wynn has gotten, but Miller explains in his memoirs that that the War of 1812, which lasted 2 years between America and the British, this war established America as the superpower in the world, right? This, or what I can say, helped to bring them a little bit further to that point of what is called, what we would call a hegemony, right? A particular world power. This doesn't become very clear to the world, I would say maybe not until after World War I, maybe even World War II, that America is the superpower. And so you have these issues that obviously come on post-World War II. So he later became a military man like his father. And as Bliss says, he was a very astute student of any topic he endeavored to study. And this definitely was revealed in his approach to Bible study. He was very, very thorough. So when he took up those 2 years of study in 1816, from 1816 to 1818, he did some intensive scripture study. And then it was about 1818 that Bliss says that he came to the conclusion that in about 25 years, Christ would come, right? So 1818 is when he reaches that conclusion. But Bliss also says that he wanted to be able to put away every objection to that. And so he says that Miller spent about another 5 years of studying until 1823 to further solidify his perspective. And between 1823 to 1832, again, he would concretize his perspective even more. So basically, Miller committed about 16 years of his life to seriously studying the Word to get his perspective rightly presented, right? And we said that he became a farmer in Pulteney, Vermont. That's seen on page 29. Even though with all this talent and all that, he still took up being a farmer in Vermont. My apologies. So we say now that Miller, in this time of skepticism, he himself became a product of this era through his acceptance of deism. Though deism may not typically be considered as philosophical skepticism, it is seen as a conduit or an avenue towards skepticism or atheism by some. Modern philosophers like Louis Dupre, Michael Buckley, and Peter Gay all state from different perspectives how deism is a complicated waypoint on the path to atheism. Right? And why this is important is because if you analyze that particular period, read the book again, Miller often talks about when he would go and preach to certain places, how he says that the deists and universalists responded very well to his messages, right? So deism, that skepticism was rampant in that period. And I can also see where, and it's interesting, right? You can have deism, which is skeptical of God by nature, and universalism, which takes hold of a personal God, but takes it to the extreme, right? And so fanaticism is very dangerous. I found a very interesting statement by Ellen White today on fanaticism. I don't know if I can just pull it up for you. But we have to be very careful when it comes to certain views and to not take up a fanatical stance on it. And let me just quote that for you very quickly. It says, this is letter 34, 1889 by Ellen White. She says, "We have found in our experience that if Satan cannot keep souls bound in the ice of indifference, he will try to push them into the fire of fanaticism." So we have to be very careful. We have to know where we're not tipping over the edge of cold indifference or fanaticism, right? Because we can easily go there. So deism was the skeptical perspective where universalism said, no, God is going to save everybody. And you go to that end where you don't realize that both perspectives do nothing to vindicate the character of God. Because deism makes God seem aloof and distant, and what universalism does, it reveals that God gives nobody freedom of choice. Because if everybody is saved, then it means that God saved everybody against their free will, right? And as we said already, Miller was an avowed deist in 1804 and is known to have returned to a belief in a personal God in 1816. Now, this is very interesting as well. This is something I actually only learned about 2-3 years ago, that Miller was also a member of the Masonic fraternity while he was in Poultney, Vermont. You see that on page 31 of that same book. And as we say here, we have not specifically pinpointed what year Miller became a Freemason, but we do know that he was one until 1831. And in 1833, he stated that Freemasonry should be treated as any other evil. Right? And Bliss informs us that Miller reached the highest rank in Freemasonry, which is known as the 33rd degree of the Scottish Rite. Right? And this was Miller. This is just showing you the character of William Miller. William Miller was a person that whenever he put his mind to something, he did it with all his might. Right? And you can see that about how thorough he is. I don't know if you ever, when you get to it, there's a poem that he's writing, and he's very thorough in the way that he writes it, very poetic, and then gives a scripture verse for every single one he's put in. It's very, very thorough. Right? And so Miller, with that mindset, reaches to that point. And if there was anyone uniquely aware of the evils of Freemasonry, you say Miller surely was, right? Now, this is a little bit more background on him. He was born in 1782, surrounded by the remnants of the Enlightenment era and other events that helped to perpetuate this kind of thinking. Now, we want to look at one of those events, which we know as the Great Lisbon Earthquake. Now, Miller obviously wasn't born then, but we want to see the thinking that certain people who were around at that time had on the Lisbon earthquake, right? And it says the Lisbon earthquake in Portugal had devastating effects so far-reaching. It is said that this earthquake claimed the lives of some 60,000 to 90,000 people. And it was obviously not just structural damage from the tremors, but you also have tsunamis that accompany that kind of earthquake, right? And one of the most famous philosophers, which we quoted just now, on this particular event, let's see what he has to say on it. Now, the French philosopher Francois Voltaire had for years contemplated the issue of a just God prior to this horrible event. In 1699, when Voltaire was only 5 years old, there was a terrible earthquake in China that claimed the lives of some 400,000 people, right? You could imagine, as 5 years old, you see an earthquake abroad claim the lives of 400,000 people. Now, my country in Barbados is only 300,000 people. That is Barbados gone in an instant, right? So in your mind at 5 years old, you can only be thinking, like, what is going on here? Now, Voltaire was actually mentored by a man called Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And if you know about him, he developed what was called the social contract, which kind of shaped what we would call a socio-political frame for countries around the world, right? So he's witnessing this, the 400,000 people die only at 5 years old. And being faced with the Lisbon earthquake, being faced with the catastrophe that was the Lisbon earthquake, Voltaire in one of his poems assessed that the idea that all will be well one day is an illusion, right? Because this is what one pope actually said, that all will be well, and in his poem he's actually mocking the pope in that poem, right? He said all will be well. Like, you see all this suffering going on, you're telling me all will be well? And Voltaire was like, this is nonsense, right? And this was Daniel Walther. I think Daniel Walther writes for the Adventist Review. He was describing how Voltaire's thought was on it. And it says, while he describes in a drastic way the catastrophe as it appears to him with the thousands of corpses of women and children, he asks the question whether that could have been the will of God or could it have been vengeance. And then, why Lisbon? Is Lisbon worse than other cities? Is there more sin and evil in Lisbon than in Paris or London? Lisbon is destroyed while they dance in Paris. Who will find the cause of this evil? God, who is love and kindness, the author of all things. Can he be considered also the author of this catastrophe? Right? This is what's going through his mind. Right? And it would have been good that people like you and I could have actually been there in 1755 to speak to this man, right? If we would have obviously had the knowledge that we do now. This is in 1755 that he's voicing this, and by about 1759, he writes a book called Candide, right, which was basically the equivalent of his, what you would call, Atheism Manifesto, right? That was the equivalent of it, and, you know, mocking certain things like this. And so you have to think that with events like this going on, and, you know, you have things like the 7 Years' War in America and the Revolutionary War, and you also have the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, you know, the War of 1812. You have all these events going on, right? And you cannot help but think that that people are seeing these issues and what is going on in their mind. How can God be good? How can God be love when all this evil is going on? And so you get a sense of why this period was a great period of skepticism. Right. And so now that the papacy's reign was coming to an end, God had to do something. He had to find a person that, as Joel would say, stand in the gap and make up the hedge, make clear to the people of the world the type of person that God is. Because if we have questions, going back to this, like this that go unanswered for a lot of people. You know, they go away with these questions unanswered in their mind, and quite often if it goes along well enough, long enough, people will believe this as truth. And I want us to understand that is how the mind works. Sometimes we allow things to fester in the mind so long that we actually think is truth. Have you ever thought, especially with us here, when we make particular quotations, have you ever thought that a statement was in a certain place, and you said, well, it was actually in Desire of Ages, page, whatever, and you think that for years, and you go back, wait a minute, it's not here. And then you actually search it, oh, this is where it is. So in your mind, it's set up as truth, because I had actually, I remember one time, I kept stating where Ellen White had made a particular statement in Patriots of Prophets, page 209, on the church that is a church of power, is a church of prayer, and I kept going back to 209. I said, I can't find this statement here. So I would go and quote it where it was presenting, and that wasn't the case. So we have to be cautious, and I wanted to set the framework for you because in the book on the development of Adventist history, the author says it's just a brief history of it, because he said he wanted to provide more of a perspective of the time that William Miller was in, right? So, and the time that Adventism emerged. Because when we see the prevailing thought on God and on his character, you would see why Adventism became relevant, right? And so the focus on the sanctuary, as we said, remember Psalm 27 verse 4, that we will inquire in his temple to know the beauty of the Lord. When we take people to the sanctuary, what we're doing is showing them the character of God, right? That is what we're doing. And so this is why Adventism was raised up at that time, with the message that it had to reorient people to the reality of God's character, so that all these dark thoughts on God would be gone, right? So we'll stop here just because of time. And I don't know if we have any lingering questions, comments. This is just setting a platform so that we can go into it a little bit deeper.
Okay, well, following the trend, I say this principle repeating in bondage. I say we are in the era of darkness and the era of light, enlightenment. Then there is the year after that is the after enlightenment as well.
Right, then you have the Great Awakening that comes.
Great Awakening.
Right.
All right. In the Great Awakening,
And this is the first Great Awakening.
the first.
Right.
Well, the Great Awakening, was that the same era where the revolution started?
Which revolution?
All revolution, French and...
So the Great Awakening, first Great Awakening starts about the 1730s, extends to about the 1750s, but really and truly, when you look at it, a lot of Enlightenment thought really stretches a little beyond that. And so, repeat the question again.
The Great Awakening, in the period of the Great Awakening, is it during or after?
Well, it's actually prior to that time, but there's obviously with any period, there's always remnants of that period that continue on. And so you can see why certain things do happen, right?
But the reason why I ask is because once I was following the French Revolution, right? And I remember when they disregarded the Bible totally. They want nothing to do with religion based on what the Catholic Church had done in the Dark Ages. And so that revolution, I think in Greek controversy said that France, if France had continued in the way God had directed them, they would be like America when America was.
Right.
Remember that statement. And she was drawing a comparison between France and America, and said that America would fall in the same, would go in the same direction that France had gone before, where France had once had the gospel and they rejected it totally. They went from one extreme to another, where they started to highlight reasoning,
Right.
and they had the goddess of reasoning, which
Right.
was Diana, and they had all type of sexual immorality going right across the board. And they said the same trend with this great nation wants to establish the principles of truth, but no, disregarding the very foundation of what birthed them.
Right.
And so this is why now I can say very carefully, but if you look at it with a very serious statement that America is the world's last hope. To declare, because America was where the Adventist movement started, and it was to be a country that would have illuminated, just like with Israel of old. Well, I can see that it is turning into that same principle, and sooner or later we may still have more revolutions.
Well, let me give you an idea of how, and we know how God works. God's going to use his people wherever they are, but he's going to use people, especially particularly in America now and everywhere. But the reason why America is because this is the center stage, really and truly. When you look at it, everything that people pay attention to, they pay attention to in America. So if you're a singer back home, you don't feel like you've made it until you make it big in America, right? Or if you are this, that, and next, you don't feel like you've made it until you've made it in America. America has set a particular standard for the world. And so God is saying, so this is where everything receives center stage, the arts, education, everything receives center stage. Let me go and put my people and my truth center stage as well, right? And, I once heard a guy say that that Christians are always complaining about what they get coming from the stream coming down. He says, we can't be complaining about it and not actually want to go and inject something also into that stream so that we contribute to what people are receiving for what's coming upstream, right, coming downstream. So we can't be complaining and say, well, we see all this stuff in the media, this and that, and then not contribute ourselves. So where there's, I think God wants us to use those talents wherever it may be, in the case where somebody, a teacher or whatever can seek to teach the truth through certain lenses and reach particular groups of people, right? And will write certain things. And often those people may not be well received, but nonetheless, they're doing the work to, bring the knowledge of God to a wider audience. So this is how God often works. Yes, he will bring the work and centralize it in a particular location where it receives a particular amount of attention. And you see that with Israel all the time as well. Whenever Israel was in a particular location, God would center the work in those particular places.
What seems to be a theme in whether or not it was the first Great Awakening or the second Great Awakening is how God deals with sin and sinners. And the question I have, can you discard the sanctuary message and still be a proponent of the character of God, still be considered a denomination that God is working with?
No, because the thing about it is that the way of God is revealed in the sanctuary. You cannot say you are vindicating the character of God when the sanctuary is the tool of vindication that God uses, right? Because, yes, Christ is the ultimate revelation, but God is saying, to get to that point of understanding that Christ is the revelation, you must go through the sanctuary first. Because I like the presentation you did yesterday on the outer court, where Jesus talks about himself as the door. If the disciples were paying close attention, they would realize that a lot of the language that Jesus used was sanctuary-based. You look at it's like, wait a minute, I know what he's talking about when he says that, right? Because Jesus takes their mind back to the sanctuary a lot. I mean, you get a chance, analyze what Jesus is saying a lot, and look at the words, realize that he takes them a lot back to the sanctuary. So you cannot be talking about vindicating the character of God and not being a proponent of the sanctuary truth. And so this is why Adventism is in a spot of bother right now, because they're giving up the sanctuary truth. And then what do you have to, proclaim? Nothing else, right? And so that is why the sanctuary truth became so essential. And this is why, even though Miller did not understand it, intently, as profoundly as he should have, nonetheless, God was able to, from that, over the years, and we'll see that in the studies to come, where the sanctuary goes through a lot of different stages, especially when you come into the 1970s. That's a whole other take on it. You remember? I don't know if you remember Desmond Ford. Desmond Ford had his perspective on the sanctuary, but that is 130 years in the future, so we're not getting there yet. All right.
Yeah, I find that some of the Adventists who have not been studying the prophecies as they relate to the days of Christ and the church, who have not been studying the prophecies and understanding how God was directing his people in the days of Christ. Not doing that, they're not able to see how God is directing at a time like this either.
Right.
Because we realize out of the messages that came to the church under the first angel message and movement, from the second, the third, etc. Not seeing the dimensions of these messages, it's so difficult for them to see and understand today that the church has nothing to do with a denomination, but a people who are searching for it.
Exactly.
In the truth, as Christ has revealed it. So I see the movements and that began under William Miller, the transition from the Millerite movement to the Adventist movement. They're not following these prophecies. And therefore, as we're about to embark upon this crisis that is coming, there's a lot of misunderstandings in how God is working.
All right, very quickly, because we're actually over time.
And as Brother Rudy said, you cannot proclaim to be teaching the third angel's message and disregard the first angel and the second angel. All of these angels that came before are important messages and angels that has to be added to the third angel. So it is impossible for you to proclaim to be teaching the third angel's message and to give up the first and second.
Exactly. Brother Jason, quickly. You had a point?
No, go ahead.
All right. Let's pray. All right. Father Heaven, we thank you once again for this opportunity to learn and to share, and we pray that we would go away vividly in our minds with the fact that you did raise us up for the purpose of vindicating your character, revealing that it is possible that you could have an evil war in your hands and still be a just God because of the freedom that you've given to all creatures. And Father, may we make this truth clear and known to the world that love necessitates freedom, and you want us to love you not because you're forcing it upon us, but a love that is generated spontaneously based on our response to what we've seen in you. And as you said in 1 John 4:19, that we love you because you first loved us. So be with us, keep us now, we pray, and take us to our separate home safely, we pray. In Jesus' wonderful name, amen.